Howdy-ho, this is Kyyberi for PokerVIP.com. Today's PLO office is about Know Your Enemy. This is part 1 of 2-part series, and we are going to focus on different kinds of opponents. And at the same time, we are going to discuss about how to exploit different opponents and how to make money in poker in general. In this first part, we're going to have overall view of different kinds of opponents and their tendencies, what mistakes they are making, how to exploit them. And in the second part, we are going to have hand histories and we go more in depth with actual examples how to play against different opponents. But let's get started. Hope you enjoy. Before we can discuss how to exploit opponents, we have to understand how do we make money in poker. And this applies to any poker format, any poker game. The idea is that our opponent mistakes in value of money minus our mistakes in value of money is our profit. So if opponent makes mistakes worth of $100 and we only make mistakes of $50, then our profit is $50. So the only way to make money in poker is to make less mistakes than our opponent. If everyone plays perfect GTO, then in the long run, no one has an edge over anyone and no one wins money, except the house. In other words, if opponent plays the hand in the same way as you would have played, neither one wins in the long run. Classic example from Hold'em is aces versus kings pre-flop. If money goes in, neither one made a mistake. Often the guy with the aces win, but someday there will be a day when the same players meet and the other one has the aces and the other one has the kings and it evens out. So often, if you look at the hand history and the opponent played his hand in the same way as you would have played, then you didn't win anything in the long run. Of course, in actual life, you either won the pot or lost, or it was a split pot. But in theory, there will be a day when the exact situation happens the other way around, and your winnings evens out. But if you are able to spot mistakes from your opponent's hand, like I would not have done that, then there's a chance that either one of you makes money in the long run. This is really important, like if you 4-bet aces and the opponent has rundown and he calls, and then you have SPR 2 or 1.5, and then on the flop the money goes in, then neither one made a mistake. So it's kind of a setup, and those are not the spots that affect your win rate in the long run. I'm constantly talking about the long run, but that's how the poker works. So if you are in a session and you can multiple spots where you can 4-bet or even 5-bet aces and get the money in against rundowns on the flop, then those are not the spots that you should be super happy about if you win, or you should be crushed if you lose those flips. Then you shouldn't worry about those. They don't affect your win rate. And often in PLO, when there's a big pot, both players have actually hit the board in some way. They have legit hands that they can stack off. So it might be a situation that the times when we get our money in are not actually the ones that affect our win rate. But what affects our win rate are those smaller pots where people make a lot of mistakes, or we make a lot of mistakes. In poker, our aim is to force our opponents to make mistakes. Now there are forced mistakes, like we know our opponent has a flush draw and we bet enough to price him out. If he calls, he makes a mathematical mistake. And then there's unforced mistakes, like our opponent just decides to play 90% of the hands, creating situations post-flop where those mistakes can become costly. So now we know how to make money. let's talk a bit about different types of players. We can divide players into 4 types. We have 2 categories. We have our pre-flop hand selection, which is either loose or tight, and then we have the aggression, which is either passive or aggressive. And when we start to combine those 2 categories, we get loose passives, which are calling stations, we get loose aggressive, which are maniacs, we get tight passives, which are nits, and we have tight aggressives, which are often referred as regulars. And you can use HUD to identify your opponent. HUD is the most easiest way to identify your opponent, and that's one of the reasons why HUD is useful even at micros or when you don't have any sample size, because often, even after 20 hands, you might spot if someone is classical calling station or super maniac or nit or regular. Or in 20 hands you cannot be absolute sure, but if someone is 95 and 0 after 20 hands, then you can assume that he is a loose passive calling station. These are the 4 main categories. And one of the beautiful things about micro PLO is that you have a lot of these really classic categories players. Like calling stations are really calling station. I have seen 100 0-0 players, VPIP 100, pre-flop raise 0. Pretty much everyone who plays micros have seen 100 players, which just press the pot button every time when they have a chance. There are super tight passive nits. The tightest one I have seen is VPIP 8, pre-flop raise 4, 3-bet of 0, and sample size was over 1000 hands. And then we have some tight aggressive regulars. And of course, there are players that don't fit 100% into each of either one of these or any of these categories, but I will talk about that later. But let's assume these 4 basic categories and see what we can do against those. First one is loose passive calling stations. Here's an example of VPIP pre-flop raise 3-bet. So if you see something like 85 and 0, you can identify him as a calling station. And these are the best customers we can have. At micros, most of our winnings come from these players, or should come. And these are our target players. Loose passive player doesn't outplay anyone. Against these players, position actually doesn't matter much because they don't outplay you. They cannot use their position that much. And we make money by value betting. There's universal poker wisdom, don't bluff calling station, and it applies to PLO. Our way to make profit at micros is not to make 3-barrel bluffs against VPIP 80 guys. Sometimes it's profitable, but it's not the main reason why we win money. So we make money by value betting. And it's really important to understand that against these calling stations, most of the value comes on the flop. Let's assume that our opponent has a flush draw on the flop. So we bet he doesn't ever fold his flush draw. So he calls with the flush draw almost every time on the flop. Second most of the value comes on the turn. Now turn is a blank and we bet. Now he thinks a bit, can I call with my flush draw? Should I call with my flush draws? There's only 1 card to come. On the flop there was 2 cards to come. Now on the turn there's only 1. So now sometimes he calls, sometimes he folds. Or let's say that on the flop he has a cut shot. He calls on the flop, he doesn't hit it on the turn, both gets bigger, he might fold. And now when the river comes, if he misses his flush, he doesn't give us any value with his flush draw or straight draw. Of course, if he has a made hand, we might get value a lot on the river too, but his calling range is the widest on the flop. often these kind of players, if they hit the board in any way, they are going to call the flop bet. Then on the turn, if the board doesn't change a lot, then they might call. And on the river, misdraws never pays a river bet. And as these players doesn't really bluff, we don't get value by bluff catching. So, as I said, usually we don't make money by bluffing. Now, the mistakes that these kind of players do is that they play with wide ranges and they call way too much. And the way to exploit that mistake is to value bet thinly. Against calling stations, top pair on the flop is standard value bet. Even just top pair on the turn you can bet for value. If you can figure out what is their calling range on the flop, how weak hands they are going to call you, then you can adjust your value bet range. But against calling stations, you have to value bet a lot. Then we have the loose aggressives, maniacs. Calling stations were the easiest opponents and best customers. Maniacs are often the hardest opponents. Something like 80, 50, 30. This is quite standard maniac pre-flop stats. Same VPIP as with calling station, but raises a lot, 3 bets a ton. When I have talked about PLO with people and asked what is the hardest thing in the tables, what gives you most problems, often people say that those maniacs. They don't know how to play against them. If you play honestly, you will be run over. The worst game plan against maniac is to play a lot of hands, raise when you hit the board, call when you have a draw, and fold when you miss. Then it's really easy for maniac to know when you have a hand, and it doesn't matter if you can, let's say you hit the flop 1 out of 5 times and you raise, you win that one flop c-bet for value, but the 4 times when you miss the board, he wins the pot. So the reason why maniacs actually make money in poker is they pick up a lot of smaller pots and medium-sized pots and only enter big pots when they have some equity. Of course, there are super random maniacs who doesn't even care about their hand, and then there are thinking maniacs. And thinking maniacs are quite hard to play if you don't know what to do. Patience is a virtue, and against maniacs, patience pays off. Another thing is that you have to trust your game plan. So you need to have a plan. How do I play against this opponent? I will talk about game planning later. But when you have a solid game plan, you know that, okay, if I do this, this, and this, I am going to make money in the long run. And then you don't have to worry about the outcome of individual hands. Like, if you have a huge hand on the turn and you just call instead of raising, an opponent hits his cut shot and you lose the pot, then you can trust your game plan that turn call was the best option. This time he happened to hit his hand, but in the long run, calling gives best value. So when you can trust your game plan, you don't have to worry about short-term outcomes. Mistakes for maniacs is that he creates or she creates big pots with mediocre and weak hands. And often their tendency is to make bad bluffs. I often call them desperation bluffs. It's a bluff that wasn't set up on the flop and turn. It wasn't the original plan. But what happens is that suddenly player finds himself on the river and he realizes that the only way to win the pot is to make our opponent fold. My hand is not strong enough. So they make a bet or raise without thinking what is our opponent range and can I represent anything strong here. But biggest mistake that Maniacs does is that creates big pots with mediocre and weak hands. Way to exploit them is to push pre-flop equity. So especially if they 3-bet a lot when you are playing 100 pp's, then you can almost eliminate post-flop playing when you 4-bet. If they use pot size bet, then when you pot size 4-bet, you can create SPR under 1.5, so you can start to 4-bet, of course, any aces, ace, king, king, ace, king, queen, queen type of hands. So you can take those sort of flips where you have a small edge. Another way to exploit is to slow play and trap. Often in PLO, you have heard that you shouldn't slow play, and often that is the truth. But against aggressives, you have to give them a chance to make a mistake. And now, if you hit the top set on the flop and you always check raise, now the opponent he's just folding his air. He's going to call with draws or some medium strength hands, but often he just folds, and you didn't win that much value as you might have won if you just call and give your opponent a chance to bluff. If turn pairs, he will represent the full house, and you can get a lot more value. Of course, every time when you slow play and set up traps, there's a chance that your opponent hits some of his outs. And that's why you need to trust your game plan. Don't look at the results, look at the way you played the hand. And the last one is don't be afraid to stack off when ahead. When you decide to sit on the same table with Maniac, you have to be ready to play big pots. If you are ahead of his range, then just stack off when you have to be stacked with it. If you always wait for the nuts before you stack off versus the Maniac, he's just going to make you fold so often or you miss value. And of course, when you are going to stack off more frequently, the variance goes up. So that is really important, that when you play with Maniac, you have to trust your game plan. And you have to accept that, okay, now there's going to be a big variance. I might lose a lot, I might win a lot. Are you ready for that? So, in a way, it doesn't make sense when people say that, oh my god, I lost 10 buy-ins when I played with that Maniac. Well, you decided to play with Maniac, so losing 10 buy-ins shouldn't be a surprise for you. It can happen. Of course, you might win 10 buy-ins, or you might be break-even, or something in between. Tight passive nits, 8, 5 and 2s, or 2. There are actually these kind of players in micro PLO, which is awesome. Well, not awesome, it's just so strange to see someone playing so tight in PLO. These nits are the worst customers we can have. Loose passives were the best customers, these are the worst customers. And often people say that, oh, I like nits, it's so easy to play against them. Well, that is true, because they fold 92 or 95 or 90% of the hands. But in poker, our goal is not to play with people who are easy to play against. We want to play with people who we can win money against. And with the nits, it's hard to get value, because they don't play a lot of hands, and when they do, they don't want to play big pots when they don't have nuts. It's really hard to stack off a nit if it's not a setup, or you are crushed. These really tight players are mostly harmless, but the problem is that they take a seat from better customers. So when you have one nit on your table, it doesn't matter, it's harmless if there are some good customers. But when there's 2 or 3 nits on the table, then suddenly it becomes hard to get any value, and they take the seat away from the better customers. So now there's this recreational superfish, and he sits on some other table. So nits are kind of players that we don't want to play with, but one of them on the table is just harmless. What often happens is that if you have this kind of nit on 6-max table, it just turns out to be 5-handed. Their mistakes are that they fold a lot, and they doesn't or don't want to play a big pot without the nuts. Way to exploit is, of course, steal a lot pre-flop, bluff a lot post-flop. Just make them fold. When loose passive players play, they are always looking a reason to call. And with the nits, tight passive ones, they are always looking a reason to fold. So give them an opportunity to fold. As said before, the way to make money in poker is to give your opponent a chance to make mistakes. Then we have the tight aggressive, regulars, thinking players. Players who are Poker VIP members or some other sites, always looking to improve their game, understand a lot about poker, maybe 2015, 7, 25, 22, 13, whatever. But this is not a need, this is not a maniac, this is not a calling station. There are many types of regulars. And often these kind of players are closest to the level of hero. And it's hardest one to have an edge on. And now, when we think about what I said in the beginning of the video, the only way to make money is to make less mistakes than your opponent. And now, let's say we have a regular that is pretty much at the level of hero. He might have some leaks that hero doesn't have, but then again, hero has some leaks that the regular doesn't have. But overall, their poker skills are at the same level. Now, in the long run, neither one makes more mistakes than the other one. So neither one wins money. And actually, because of the rate, both of them are losing money. To make money against regular, you have to be better enough than the other player. You have to beat the rate. And with these regulars, this is often the only player that gets better over time. So today I might have an edge over you, but let's say we go 6 months forward, I don't improve, you do a lot of work in improving, now you might have an edge over me. And if you think it in this way, if I don't have an edge over a regular, is it profitable in the long run to play with him? And often, or pretty much always, the answer is no. You have to be better. You have to have an edge over your opponent. This is something that most micro regulars don't really understand. They are happy to sit in the table with 5 other regulars when there are tables with fishies and maniacs and recreationals and nits and so on and so on. Some people use the same argument that with the nits, that I don't mind playing with regulars, they are easy to play. Or I make more money against regulars because I can bluff them, they are thinking players. Well, in a sense that is true. Against regulars you can make a lot of stuff that you cannot do against the other types. Because now you can really play poker. You can think on different levels. You know that the opponent is capable of thinking about ranges. You can represent. But at the same time, is your edge against them bigger than it is against passive calling stations? Mistakes and exploit, it would be quite hard to list every possible mistake and way to exploit them for regulars. The idea is to find the leaks and exploit them as long as you can. Now, as I said, these kind of players improve. So when you find a leak and start to exploit that, it might be that after a month he doesn't give you a chance to exploit it anymore. So you always have to stay alert if their tendencies change. Often you play most hands with regulars, so make sure you study how they play. Now, regulars are a small portion of the player pool. Let's say a network at micro stakes, there might be like 100 players in the pool, and 10 of those are regulars. So only 10% of the players are classified as regulars or tight aggressive players. but each one of them is multi-tabling. So suddenly you might have a situation that you are playing 10 tables and you have 2 or 3 regulars, same regulars in each of those tables. So suddenly half of your hands are against regulars. And at the same time you're trying to make money against the worst players, and you have to make money against the regulars. Or if one regular is better than you, he has an edge over you, you have to minimize your losses in the long term. So if you find yourself playing with same players a lot of times, then use your time to study what are their tendencies, how can I exploit them. There are many ways that regulars might make mistakes. It's just your job to find them. Well, is it that simple? You just categorize your opponent and start printing money. Well, in one way it is, but on the other hand, everyone is an individual. There are players who are really aggressive pre-flop, but post-flop they are quite honest and passive. Then there are really passive pre-flop calling stations that suddenly are super aggressive on the turn and reverse. Then there are really tight nits who fold it on post-flop. And then there are nits who wait for the strong hand so long that when they actually have it, they just can't fold it. And they overcall post-flop. So you don't make money by bluffing post-flop. You make money by value betting thinning post-flop. And so on and so on. There are regulars who often play solid but field often and become maniacs post-flop. So everyone is an individual. And the key is to understand how certain tendencies can be exploited. Today we have talked about different tendencies about 4 main categorized players and talk about how to exploit those tendencies. When you understand these and you know the basic principles against each of the 4 types, then it's easy to adjust and adapt whoever is against you. And the really important thing is this. Think about your game plan. How do I make money against that specific player? And this is something that a good poker player should be always thinking. When you sit on the table, the first question is, where does my money come from? Which are my main target players? Against which players I have a definite edge over? Which players I don't have an edge? Which players are probably at the same level as I am? So you know who are you targeting. And against each player on the table, in a full 6-max table, you have 5 opponents. Now you should be able to say against each one of those 5, how do I make money against that player? What are the reasons why I make money from that player? And if you don't know the answer, then you better find it out. Because if you don't know how to make the money, then you are just pressing buttons and hoping to win. Hope to be lucky enough to win. But that's not a solid plan to make money in the long term. If you have an aggressive player on the table, then ask yourself, what is my game plan? How do I make money? And if you don't know the answer, then it might be probably better to find another table. Like if you have 5 opponents and you don't know how to make money against any of those, then you are probably the fish on the table. So change the table until you find opponents that you know how to exploit. This was the first series, or first part of 2-part series about knowing your enemy. On the next part, I'm going to show you some example hands against different types of opponents and how does the opponent's tendencies affect our decision making. So, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope everyone got something to think about. And I'll see you on the next time. This was Poker VIP video. My name was Kyyberi, and bye bye.